Then There's California, a podcast featuring members of the California State Senate Democratic Caucus in conversation about their lives, their legislative priorities, policies, and other related issues that help make California exceptional. This is our 50th episode, on our way to forever. From the state capitol in Sacramento, I'm Brian Green. In January of 1969, a blowout at the Union Oil platform located 6 miles off the coast of Santa Barbara spilled close to 100,000 barrels of crude oil into the Santa Barbara Channel and onto the beautiful beaches of California's south coast. At the time, it was the largest oil spill in U.S. waters and remains still the largest oil spill to have ever occurred adjacent to our state's coastline. Journalists at the time called it the ecological shot heard round the world, and indeed it was the turning point in not only Santa Barbara's and California's environmental advocacy and stewardship, but also compelled the ecological coming of age for the rest of the country. The oil spill and the devastation it caused to our natural resources and marine life was also the catalyst for the grassroots college student ecological awareness movement that turned into our annual Earth Day, which is commemorated every spring by millions of people globally, and it will celebrate its 51st anniversary on April 22nd of this year. Here at home, the oil spill also left its mark, figuratively, on the ecological consciousness of the Santa Barbara community and the entire state as we began to nurture our identity as an environmental justice bellwether for the rest of the globe, an identity that has evolved and has had to be fought for in the 21st century debate over climate change. On this edition of Then There's California, as we get ready to honor Earth Day 2021, we'll reflect on the status of California's environmental advocacy and foresight in the 52 years since the Santa Barbara oil spill, and how even a bit more than a half a century later, California is still fighting to find the organic, economic, political, and climate-sustaining balance between environmental protection and restoration, the still entrenching debate over fossil fuels and clean energy, housing shortages and coastal erosion prevention, and the stifling, or at least holding at bay, of the devastating effects of global warming, even as the United Nations warns us that civilization has less than a year to get our act together if there is to be any hope of staving off a climate catastrophe by the end of the century. Monique Limón is the freshman state senator representing the 19th California Senate District that still bears the memory and the environmental passion that came from that 1969 oil spill, including the city and county of Santa Barbara and southbound down the coast, covering most of Ventura County. Senator Limón brings to the Senate her legislative priorities of consumer protection, education, women's equality, and emergency response, and, of course, environmental protection, did you even have to ask, that she honed while serving 2 terms prior to the Senate, representing her coastal and inland communities in the state assembly. Senator Limón chaired the Assembly Banking and Finance Committee, and she holds the gavel for the same committee in the state Senate. She's a Santa Barbara County native, and before coming to Sacramento, she spent 14 years focused on education leadership, including 6 years on the Santa Barbara Unified School Board. Senator Limón joins us by phone from her home just north in the city of Santa Barbara in Goleta. Senator Monique Limón, welcome to Then There's California. How are you?
Thank you. I am doing well, and you are right. I am in Goleta, actually less than a mile away from the UCSB campus and our coast and so much. So I am listening to you talk about a history that's very much part of the community that I live in and the community that I represent.
Welcome to the Senate. We've discussed so many times on this podcast with your colleagues how the pandemic has transformed legislative life in the last year, and I know it has particularly for you.
It has, absolutely. There's so much about this pandemic that has changed for me, both legislatively but also personally. I went from being in the assembly to coming over to the state senate, and I also had a little one. So
Congrats.
Yes, a mother of a 5-month-old little one.
And so you essentially are working from home, literally, in most cases on each legislative day, right?
Right. So it is a mixture. I have to tell you that in this particular role, you just make it work every day. So I've been up to Sacramento. I've been working in the district office, Zooming like, millions of other individuals from home and doing kind of a combination just to make sure the work gets done.
Well, I was in attendance there at your first hearing of the Senate Banking and Finance Committee earlier this month, and I think you had said it was your first time in the Capitol in person as a new senator, and you were welcomed by everybody like a long-lost friend. So that must have been a nice feeling.
It was. It really was. And I think that one of the really neat things about me serving in the legislature for 4 years in the Assembly is that I do feel like I've come over to the Senate, and so many of my colleagues already knew who I was. We've had a relationship through my work in the Assembly, and it felt great. I mean, I was greeted with a lot of warm wishes. You had Senator Susan Eggman, who greeted me with a wonderful loaf of her homemade sourdough bread. And Senator Rubio made sure that I came home with this wonderful RBG commemorative necklace that we would be wearing for a resolution. I mean, the list just kind of goes on. It was a very, very nice, warm welcome. It's a wonderful reminder of how much I miss the Capitol. I think like so many folks do, right? The Capitol is a very special place for us if we're a constituent, a legislator, or even working in the advocacy and lobbying world. We miss some of those days of all being physically around the Capitol and seeing each other. But I'm confident those days will come, when the time is right.
Amen to that. A little bit more about you. Am I right? You were born and grew up in Santa Barbara?
Yeah, that's right. So born and raised here in Santa Barbara County, and I feel so lucky to represent the district that I was born in, the district that watched me grow up, the district that invested in my own success. And so it's an honor, but it's also a sense of accountability. This is home. I know these folks, right? Like I know the people who I represent. And so I think that there are times where you remember that when all of this is done, when this legislative world is done, because we have time limits and it will be done, that I will still be a part of this community. That is my hope. And that's been, my reality. And so I know a lot of these issues, not just as a state legislator who becomes a subject matter expert through policy, but also as lived experiences, as part of me growing up here. And I think that is something that I bring that's unique. How I think, my relationship with the community, with the region that I represent, is very much one of watching this region, like so many others, change over the last decades, but also continue to have strong values on some of the things that we hold important to us.
As hard as it must have been to leave home, I mean, it is Santa Barbara, you went to college in Columbia University?
So I did my undergrad at UC Berkeley, and I did my master's work at
Columbia. Good clarification. Okay.
Yes, yeah. So I did both. I did the Bay Area, and then I also did the East Coast. And so I loved both of my experiences as an undergrad, as a graduate student, undergrad at UC Berkeley, graduate student at Columbia University. And I'm very glad that I spent some time in New York City. I think that for a lot of us on the West Coast, especially California being the fifth largest economy, being a very big state, it's great to get a little bit of, leave the state and get a perspective. I have to tell you that one of my takeaways from living and going to graduate school in New York at Columbia is how much more the international perspective influences general policy conversations in the state of New York. So I think that that's a little bit different than what I see here at the state level. And I think it's because California is so big. So we have a lot of issues that impact so many people. And I think with New York, having Washington, D.C. not so far away, having the UN there, I mean, so many aspects of different elements of the geography in New York that allow for also an international policy discussion in a lot of the work we do.
Well, let's talk about your 19th Senate District. It's one of the most beautiful places in the world. It's coastline, it's ocean views, but it is more than palm trees and now Meghan Markle. The tourism industry in your district is supported by a deep, essential worker service economy, and there's also a thriving agricultural industry in and around there, too.
Absolutely, and that's what I love about the district that I represent. I think that perhaps when people first think of Santa Barbara, those that have been around long enough probably think of the soap opera, but also they think of beaches and coasts. They hear maybe the name mentioned when they hear people like the fact that Oprah or Ellen DeGeneres or now, Prince Harry and Meghan Markle live in the district. But the thing is that Santa Barbara County and Ventura County, the district that I represent, is so much more than that. As you've mentioned, we have agriculture. Ventura County is the 8th largest agriculture producer in the state of California. Ventura County has the city of Oxnard, the 18th largest city in the state of California. I have in Santa Barbara and Ventura County communities that are really small, like Guadalupe, very small agriculture, rural communities. And then I have these big cities that I represent, like Oxnard, as I mentioned. And so I think that that is one of the very neat things about my district. I have coastal, I have inland, I have rural, I have urban. All of that is part of what I represent. But also, I think, is part of what influences how I think about all legislation, whether it's the legislation I champion or the legislation that's in front of me to review. I have a father who has worked in the service industry, right? He worked as a hotel worker, gardener for decades here in this community. So I also know how much the tourism industry and the service industry plays in terms of weighing into our local economy. It is big. And so certainly the pandemic has impacted really the tourism, the hotel, restaurant industry in really, really impactful and challenging ways. And I've lived that through the lens of my family. And that's something that I think is important to also highlight, because Santa Barbara is so many amazing and beautiful things, and certainly the cover of wonderful pictures and magazines, but it's also the everyday experience of so many individuals that are making the local economy, the regional economy, and California work. And sometimes individuals that are a little bit more invisible. And so I think that for me, since it's also a lived experience, I try really hard to make the invisible visible through my legislation.
Well, talking about the 19th District and the economy and the people, including your own family that has been there for generations, coming out of the dark here, so to speak, the virus counts go down, Lord willing, and people get vaccinated. How are people doing?
People, I think, over the last 12 months it's been, a lot of different stages of this virus. And I say that because when I think of the pandemic and I think of what COVID-19 has done, there's so many different buckets. They're policy buckets, right, that fall under this big global pandemic umbrella. We've dealt with unemployment, the EDD department, with reopening schools, with reopening small businesses, helping small businesses and nonprofits keep going in our community. We've dealt with the health issues directly, like what does it mean? What do we know about this virus? And currently we're also in the stage of having to identify the vaccine rollout. And there's been this great announcement that anyone 16 and older will be eligible for the vaccine. Think of that. We've gone a year, and now those 16 and over will be eligible for a vaccine. So I think we've had a lot of different phases. And in all of those phases, there has been an abundance of challenges and imperfections. But nonetheless, I still think, look, we're still here, folks. As a community, as a region, as a state, we're still making it work. And I think that we've lived through an unexpected and incredibly challenging moment through the pandemic. It has been very hard for the people that I represent, but we are also, I think, showing that this community is really resilient. And I learned that being a representative during, for example, the Thomas Fire. I saw the resilience of our community.
Absolutely.
When we had the Montecito debris flow, that unfortunately was really difficult when we saw the 23 lives that we lost in our community during that time. We were resilient. When I saw Ventura County devastated by, again, wildfires that impacted thousands of homes, at one point, I think I represented a district that had over 100,000 people evacuated. Those are all really difficult moments that we have lived, that I have lived as a representative of this area, but that have taught me that this community is incredibly resilient. And that resiliency is exactly what I see right now with the pandemic. Our community is still going. It has been so challenging, but we are still going. And that's what I love about this, that as elected officials, we don't do everything ourselves. We really are a voice and a liaison for the district. And there's so much that the district teaches us about how to better serve our community, how government can play a more effective role in the work we do. And I think that that's what you've seen in the last 12 months.
Wow, that is almost poetic, Senator. Thank you for that narrative. And it just fills me with hope knowing that using your district as an example of so much of what California is about, that we are on a healing trend, and that's good to know. Well, let's talk about the South Coast and your district's environmental disaster legacy. and the effect that the 1969 oil spill had on your community, and the galvanizing effect that it actually had on environmental policy and excitement and foresight related to the environment for generations. I assume the South Coast's identity is really still fixed in that environmental legacy, obviously, notwithstanding also the Thomas Fire and the mud flows and the other wildfires just in the last few years. How has it framed your own legislative environmental advocacy moving forward?
Well, it certainly has framed it in a very, I think, meaningful way. In my 4 years in the Assembly and now in the State Senate, I have championed issues related to our coast, the environment, and certainly oil issues as well. And I have to say that sometimes the narrative becomes those on the coast don't understand the life, the realities of others throughout the state of California, including in the Central Valley. And I think that that's probably a false narrative to some extent, because I think that it's more that our lens is slightly different, but it's slightly different based on our lived experiences. And you're talking about an 1969 oil spill that was very much a lived experience of our community. We are a district, both Ventura and Santa Barbara County, have a history with oil extraction and production that goes well beyond my lifetime, actually. It's a deep history here. And because Ventura and Santa Barbara County participated so heavily in this creating oil space, we've also lived, unfortunately, some of the really negative and harmful and challenging impacts of being counties that have produced so much, and that includes the oil spill. We have had our share of both coastal spills and inland spills. We've had pipelines break. We know this issue in a different way. And so I think that it's not that the coast doesn't understand that so many states, and the state of California has a history of producing their own energy, but it really is that the methods that we have chosen historically in terms of where to extract our energy from, including fossil fuels, have had a really challenging and negative impact.
Indeed. It's not just an elitist palm tree beach attitude. It is imprinted from a group of survivors that have gone through the generations from 1969, the paint fire in 1990, all of the natural and environmental challenges that just that district alone has faced.
Absolutely. And I actually think now you've put it very poetic. And you're right. We are survivors. And I think that is really important. As the first person of color, woman of color, to represent this Senate district in the state legislature, I bring multiple lenses. I get what it's like to grow up in a working class home where, parents have to have multiple jobs to make ends meet. I understand what it means to put food on the table and how important that is. And it's that lens that I bring to a lot of this in thinking about the environment. I've been not just a champion for, I think, traditional environmental issues, but also environmental justice issues as they impact the working class, people of color, underrepresented communities, and underrepresented regions. And so I think for me, that's where, when I think back at the 1969 oil spill in Santa Barbara County, and it's still holding the record for the largest oil spill off the coast of our state, I bring now a 2021 diverse lens to it, but one that still understands that these impacts were deep. You look at the impacts to our environment, to the economy. I talked earlier about how much our economy relies on tourism, and I can tell you right now, with oil spills in our community, you see major reduction in tourism. And so all of these things impact our community. They impact our environment, not just the sea life, but the humans as well. I remember there was an oil spill in 2015 along our Gaviota coast.
Right.
Some of that was inland as well. And I remember hearing from farmers and ranchers that all of a sudden, right, like they didn't understand what was happening, but they found some of their livestock dead right after the oil spill. And so there was all these things, and certainly I'm not the scientist that makes the causation a reality, but you just realize that it's a bigger picture, broader conversations, and contamination of soil, air, and water is detrimental to all. And that's exactly what we're trying to protect.
And I would imagine that anyone running for office or being elected to office has to look at policy and public policy life through this lens that you talk about, framed by the environmental movement and environmental impacts. I mean, you shouldn't even have the nerve to put your name on the ballot in Santa Barbara County or in the Central or South Coast if you don't have some sort of environmental cred or at least respect for it. Is that correct?
And I would definitely say I'm going to go with the latter, with respect for it. And here's why. Because as someone who spent 14 years working in higher ed, I think people in our district, I got a lot of questions like, what are your environmental creds? And I realized that sometimes the environmental creds that we talk about tend to be environmental creds of a environmental movement that wasn't always reflective of the diversity of the state of California or the diversity of our country. And I often describe that my environmental cred really is about knowing what it's like for communities of color to live near major transportation hubs, to live near areas where they didn't have reliable clean water, but also growing up in a household where we preserved every drop of water, where we reused and recycled so many dishes. In Latino households, like there's this running joke that we were environmentalists before we knew what that was, because you never threw away plastic. Like you're
right.
Like, no, that needs to get 3 or 4 uses. We laugh that you would open up a plastic container labeled as butter, and inside you would find some incredible green salsa, right? I mean, that is all those little things. I think so much of my father, we would collect the clean running water in our household before it got warm, because you're like, you don't let clean running water go to waste. Like that's water that needs to be collected to use for other purposes. And so I think that like those are the moments where I think about maybe those weren't my traditional mainstream environmental moments that people can think of, but those moments created a respect for our environment and for our natural resources that I think is deeply rooted in me. And so I encourage folks to know that educators, that social workers, folks working in small businesses can also be environmental leaders. But sometimes maybe our credentials are, maybe we weren't on the right nonprofit board, but we certainly were, leaders and thinking about these deep issues in our community.
And you're right. You don't have to have just stepped up a Greenpeace ship to have some credential or credibility, but you have lived it. So let's fast forward to 2021. The climate change foresight and fight in the 21st century is getting grim. As we mentioned, the UN report that says we have 10 months. I had to go back and look at that. 10 months that California has been leading the planning and environmental policy and climate change stewardship and preparation, and has the most progressive and stringent environmental laws in the U.S., if not the world. But going into this third decade of the 21st century, California is still stumbling and contradicting itself on its climate change planning and actions. The California State Auditor released a report recently that says our state is doing a poor job of tracking climate progress, which is hampering its ability to meet climate change goals. So what does that mean to you as a lawmaker, as an environmental justice advocate, as a human being?
I think that for me, as I listen and I too have read some of the state auditors, reports, I think that it's important to recognize that in this space of moving towards environmental goals that I think are lofty and I think are very, very, very important. I am supportive of our goals. It is also important to recognize that those goals don't just happen because we've set them, that they require us to be very intentional, not just as state legislators, not just as elected officials, but really in our community. Our community has to be aligned with our goals. We all have to play a role as an everyday citizen to be able to reach these lofty goals. And I think that that is part of what we're seeing. I believe that it's important to set these goals and to have these goals. And in moments like this, when we're asked to reflect on those goals and whether we will be able to meet them, if the answer is no, which I think we're seeing, we have to go back to the drawing table and figure out what it's going to take to be able to reach those goals. But again, these goals aren't reached just because they're set. They're reached when there's a lot of intention and purpose in the work that we do. I know that so many think that California has the answers in terms of the environment, or that we believe we have the answers. But I think that California is a state, and this is what I believe, that challenges itself to find the answers, to create the answers in order to reach these environmental goals. And that's where I think we're at as a legislature, that we are finding that we have to challenge ourselves to go back to understand what it's going to take to reach those goals. And it almost sounds so simple, like, oh, we go back to the drawing table. But I have to tell you that some of the questions that come to mind are among the most complicated questions that we can ask ourselves and that we can solve for. And those include, how do you ensure that everyone's purpose and goals are equitable? How do you ensure that we afford the future of a greener economy when sometimes the greener economy takes more financial investment than the status quo? How do we ensure that across the state of California, all 58 different counties have the ability to move at the same pace to reach these goals? I mean, those are just some of the questions among hundreds of questions that come up about how we accomplish this. And I think that that's where we're at. We really have to ask ourselves these difficult questions. And as someone who has authored legislation and continues to author legislation that can be challenging, legislation that pushes the status quo, I really believe that it's important for us as legislators to introduce these bills, to put our name to some of this, even if we are not able to get to the end goal that we'd like through legislation. I think that it is so important for us and for the state of California to be able to have a bill that produces a legislative review. That is critical. We have got to have legislative review that allows for a discussion, for debate, for input, for analysis, and for a timely process that gives our constituents more information about how we get to these goals, or maybe what the challenges are and the roadblocks are to getting these goals. And I think that that's what you see, and certainly what I've tried to do as a legislator.
This is offering me the perfect entree to use your conversation and comments about the challenges and the conversation, and I guess you could say the tension, particularly between our state's reliance on and the promotion of and the creation of new sources of fossil fuel versus our search and creation of a green and clean economy. And looking back at the 1969 oil spill and fast forwarding to now, the tension is still there. And California is again the leader in creating carbon policy and forward thinking when it comes to transitioning to clean sources of energy. The governor broke the bank on some foresightfulness last year when he put California on the track to transitioning to all electric vehicles. But at the same time, we are still approving new oil leases in the state and propping up a fossil fuel economy. We're still drilling for oil and still fracking, putting lives and air and climate at further risk, and defying the progressive green thinking public opinion. You're no stranger, as you say, to pushing against fossil fuel and the impact of oil drilling in our state and wanting to have that conversation. And here in 2021, you have this bill with your colleague, Senator Scott Wiener, a really sobering, landscape-changing legislation to slow down fracking and other oil extraction practices in California by 2022 and then ban it outright by 2025. So tell us about SB 467, but just as importantly, which I know you want from this bill, is the conversation through the legislative process.
Absolutely. So Senate Bill 467 is a bill that Senator Scott Wiener is leading, and I've joined him in this particular legislative pursuit. Is a bill that would do two things. One, it would phase out fracking and cichlid steaming, both low pressure and high pressure cichlid steaming, which we have in the district that I represent. We have low pressure cyclic steaming. And it also would require that we have setbacks so that we have a space between where the oil extraction and production is happening with homes and schools. Both of these elements are very, very big legislative lifts. We have not had a conversation about phasing out fracking or banning fracking in our state for 14 years. Since then, Senator Holly Mitchell introduced it. And I think that it was really important for me to join Senator Wiener in this effort because, as I've chatted about in this particular conversation, there's a history in the district that I represent with oil extraction and production. And I think it's important to recognize that. And it's important to have someone also part of the conversation who has that history, who has that lived experience of what it means to the district. And I think additionally, with the setbacks, it's very much a health conversation. There are a lot of health conversations about this. Independent of this legislative bill, I think it's important to recognize that Senator Scott Wiener and I are championing this, but we're not the only ones in the world, in our country, or in the state talking about this. We have introduced a bill to allow for exactly this, a legislative conversation, a legislative review, a legislative analysis on conversations that are happening all around us. Governor Newsom in October of 2020 said, I want the legislature to bring me a fracking ban. And so guess what? That is exactly what's happening. When our now president, Biden, was sworn in, within his first week, he stopped a very big oil pipeline project, the XL oil pipeline project, questioning whether that was the future of energy and whether that was a safe process or tool. And so I think that we're watching so many folks around us work on these issues. I know that CalGEM, which is one of our state agencies that oversees oil and gas production and permits, they are working on a report on setbacks to understand what the science is and what could be recommendations. So again, all around us, there are conversations, there are ideas, policy ideas, and laws that are changing, that are moving. I mean, I'm watching my local cities decide that all new building will have only electric sources of energy as opposed to natural gas. I mean, I'm watching folks all around us make these decisions about the future of energy. So I think it was really important for us to have a vehicle to have a discussion. Having said that, wow, I got to tell you, the amount of both incredible support that we've gotten throughout the state on this bill, but also opposition that includes threats, that includes major concern, is very real. We have both happening right now. I have people who are thanking me for being brave enough to work on this legislation with Senator Wiener, but I also have people who are so upset, disappointed, threatening all these things because they can't believe that we have introduced a legislative bill that would require discussion.
And unfortunately, a lot of it in your own backyard, too. I mean, there's even division within your county board of supervisors and local government.
Absolutely. Yes. And so I think that it is one of those elements that is important to, I think, recognize that the feelings are different. But anytime that there is change on policy and that we disrupt the status quo, it comes with the territory of really people who are really much looking forward to it, but those who are not. I think it would be a disservice to the state of California to not have a legislative vehicle to have these conversations when local governments, county governments, folks at the federal level are having a discussion about it. I don't know where this bill will end up, but I do feel like it is important to allow for a legislative conversation about it. We will find out soon in the next few weeks if the bill even makes it out of the first two committees in the Senate, Natural Resources and EQ, and we will see where it goes from there. But I do feel that this was important for me to do. I believe that the people that I represent elected me to represent them, knowing that I would ask and raise some of the hard questions and difficult questions. And that is, I think, what I'm doing. So whether people agree with where I stand on this particular policy issue, I hope that they recognize that part of my job is raising some of the more complicated questions, policy discussions as well around these issues. And I think that that's what I'm doing.
Well, in fact, there was a story in today's San Francisco Chronicle about a Bay Area company's proposal to drill a natural gas well in the Suisun Marsh, south of Suisun City in Solano County, which is being positioned as this latest flashpoint in our state's quest to transition away from fossil fuels. The company wants to drill for gas at an already abandoned well, and if they find enough fuel there, the project could be operational for 20 years. Possible environmental threat, but it could heat homes and light stoves in the Bay Area for 20 years. So here's an example of that tension between our climate ideals and the realities that are going on right in front of us.
Yeah. And I think that, another issue within the oil space that I work a lot on are abandoned and orphan wells in our state. And certainly we have hundreds, by the way, in the district that I represent.
Yes.
So yeah, these are the conversations that are happening. And I think it's important that as CalGEM looks at whether or not permitting is going to be allowed for some of these processes in these local areas, that we have these conversations about what do we want the future to be. I don't think that getting to a future with all green energy is going to be an easy goal. I think it's going to be a difficult goal, but if we don't begin the conversations about how we get there and what it's going to take on, especially on our reliance on fossil fuels, I don't know how we'll get there smoothly. And I want to raise another point, because I feel like this is an issue that sometimes, actually not sometimes, very often gets included in the debate: the role of our brothers and sisters in labor, and the fact that there are labor jobs in the fossil fuel industry. And I think that it is a very important recognition to understand that the fear of transitioning to really a space that's new, a space where the jobs are not clear what they will be or if they will be good jobs, all of those things, is a scary one. But I also feel like we have to have a conversation. I look at the fact that in other states, for example, you have states where coal was very big, and there weren't always those discussions about how we transition labor into new forms of energy. And I think that what ends up happening is that there are elements that have the potential to leave folks behind. And so I think that for us having this conversation, I do believe we want labor to be part of these conversations and help us understand how we transition there. But this idea that we say no to everything when everything around us is moving is, I think, what's causing some of the concern and tension. And I know that the fear is real. I know that people don't know what to think about when your job and your industry may be eliminated over time. But I also think that that's exactly what we need to be talking about. What does it look like? How do we transition and make sure that, our brothers and sisters in labor are also part of our conversation, that they're very much part of the future, whatever the future looks like.
And I believe, or I hope that those are reassuring words to those who push back against you about how legislation like this will decimate 90% of the California oil and gas sector of our economy, particularly in the Central Valley, while some would say not really doing anything about oil use and consumption. So that tension is still there, but at least you're acknowledging that the tension is there and you want to try to work with all parties to move forward.
Absolutely. And the tension will continue to be there with or without a bill, I have to tell you. And so I think, again, it's important to recognize that, but to bring folks with us. And this isn't easy. I've repeated that over and over. And we do this with the recognition that this is a heavy lift, that it's not easy, that it makes so many of us, including some of our colleagues, uncomfortable to even have these conversations. But it is also important to recognize that this is our role to raise some of the most difficult questions in a state that's the fifth largest economy of the world.
I can't leave a conversation with you, Senator Limón, without talking about the role of women in climate change leadership and policymaking. You're a member of the Legislative Women's Caucus. You're a former member of the Santa Barbara County Commission on the Status of Women. Equality and gender justice are a top priority for you. President Biden is working with former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton to create a White House Gender Policy Council to ensure that every government agency considers how its policies, including those related to climate change, intersect with the lives and the careers of women and the LGBTQ community. I want to get your thoughts on that and to maybe reflect on the other strong women voices that are already speaking out and having an impact and influencing climate change policy.
Yeah. And yes, I think that as a woman, as a sister, as an aunt, as a mother, there are so many roles that I think of what makes me a strong voice in this particular environmental space. And just last year, actually, the California League of Conservation Voters named me California's Climate Queen. They awarded me this wonderful recognition for my work in this space, around climate change and reducing the use of fossil fuels. And look, I absolutely believe that there will be generations after me that will be dealing with climate change and its impact. And it is my hope that what we can leave to them is a fair and equitable attempt to do something about it, as opposed to just standing back and doing nothing at all. I think that as a community that has dealt with the impacts of climate change, both because we've seen an increase in drier conditions that have produced more fuel for bigger fires, but also because we're on the coast. And so we know what sea level rise looks like and feels like, sea level degradation. All of that is, I think, important elements of what we see and what we live. And so I think that I live it in a way that's very real to me. And I know that the generations after me will also do the same. So I think it's important to raise that voice. And I'm proud that I am a woman, that I am a Latina raising these issues for our district and for the state. But I think we're seeing more women raise these issues and concerns. But certainly I believe it is so critical to have, again, just voices and faces that represent and look like the state of California. And when the state of California is predominantly women, I hope that we will see more women raising these issues.
Great. Just a final thought as we wrap up here, Senator. If this conversation hasn't been sobering enough, I'm actually in the middle of reading this powerful new book written by a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist, Elizabeth Kolbert. It's small in size, but large in its impact. It's called Under a White Sky, The Nature of the Future. And Elizabeth Kolbert implies that it is essentially too late to save the environment. There's no going back. There's no natural nature left, that we live in the world and climate we have already altered beyond change. And our interventions to fix it have gone awry, and we no longer have the luxury of only contemplating the solutions we would prefer, that we now have to fix the fixes and manage the mess we made because we can't heal it. For example, she interviews a solar energy expert who says there's no sense trying to reduce fossil fuel emissions or lower the temperature preventatively. We're going to have to solar engineer the sun. We are going to have to find a way to dim the sun, saying that dimming the sun might be less risky than not doing it. So a couple of generations ago, this book would read as science fiction. But now this book by this Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist is a life primer on survival. So, Senator, put your futurist hat on. What do you think of that?
I think that every single conversation is worthy of being on the table at now. I think what I probably would not resonate with as much is the idea that we give up right now. I absolutely do not believe we give up.
I'm glad to hear you say that.
Yeah, if we would have given up on the pandemic, on all these other issues, I think we would be in a difficult situation. I do not believe that we give up. I wake up every single day and I do what I can that day to make life better, our jobs better, education better. It doesn't mean that I accomplish it every day. It certainly means I have setbacks every single day. But if what I do is wake up every single day and just do my best that day to help our constituents, then so be it. The second that I gave up on this philosophy is, I think, the second that we see a regression that will go much faster than I'd like it to see. And I think that that's where I don't resonate. Do I believe that we're going to have to think outside of the box because we have had such a horrible and negative impact on the environment? Yes, absolutely. Do I think everything should be explored? Absolutely. Does it mean we do every option that we explore? No, we explore every option. But I don't believe that you give up. We still have to keep going. And, you know, I think Mother Nature is resilient, but we've done a lot to Mother Nature. And we keep going. We keep going and trying every single day to do our part, because if we don't do our part, we will really get to a world where we see the tougher impacts of climate change lived in a much more real and much more difficult and harmful way.
Senator Limón, thank you so much for putting such a positive accent on such a sobering topic. Sobering, but fun. It's been fun to talk to you. Thank you so much. And thank you for the opportunity to talk to royalty, the state's climate queen. I love that. That's a crown you should keep wearing.
It's a fun one. So thank you so much, Brian. I really appreciate this. It's been a great conversation. I look forward to our next one.
I do, too. And hopefully, Lord willing, it will be in person. Thank you very much,
Yes.
State Senator Monique Limón from Santa Barbara County. And that brings us to a close of this edition of Then There's California. We're a production of the California State Senate Democratic Caucus, with technical assistance and support from Martin Ashley, Bob Brulte, Brian Shadden, Rainier Sabiniano, Gunshin Patel, John Roman, McLenna Woods, Lisa Murphy, Ann DeGrazia, and the graphic design talents of Tim Davis. On behalf of State Senator Monique Limón of Santa Barbara, I'm Brian Green at the State Capitol, and thanks for listening. to then there's California.